Magnus and Eno's story began like any other college romance, but to Magnus it was nothing short of extraordinary. He remembered the exact moment he first saw her during his sophomore year of college. Sitting alone in the bustling university library, Magnus was buried in engineering textbooks, determined to ace his exams. When Eno walked in, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. Her long flowing hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes carried an air of mystery that intrigued him. She was like a puzzle, and Magnus was desperate to understand every piece. For the first time, the usually reserved Magnus mustered the courage to step outside his comfort zone and approached her. As the weeks went by, Magnus and Eno continued to meet at the library, exchanging not only ideas but also pieces of their lives. Magnus couldn't stop thinking about her. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. While his life had always been controlled and orderly, Eno was free-spirited and unpredictable. She didn't seem to follow the rules of life that Magnus had lived by. She painted her world with broad, bold strokes, while he was used to living in careful lines. Soon their library sessions turned into late-night coffee dates at a small cafe near campus. They shared stories about their childhoods, their dreams, and their fears. Eno introduced him to her world of art, while Magnus helped her understand the mechanics of engineering. Their conversations were a mix of intellectual debates, humor, and vulnerability. Magnus began to see her as a muse, someone who inspired him to think outside the box and embrace the beauty of spontaneity. It didn't take long for Magnus to realize that he had fallen for Eno. Her eccentricities, her passion for life, and her kindness all captivated him. What started as admiration turned into something deeper. Every moment with her felt like a revelation. He found himself constantly thinking about her, trying to understand her in ways he never thought possible. Eno too seemed to be falling for him. She admired his intelligence, his dedication, and the quiet way he supported her. She had never met someone so focused on their goals yet willing to take the time to understand her chaotic world. Magnus made her feel seen and understood in ways she hadn't experienced before. They spent their weekends together, exploring the city, visiting art galleries, and finding hidden corners to talk about everything and nothing. Magnus was no longer content to live in his structured, solitary world. He wanted to build a future with Eno, a future filled with love, art, and shared dreams. The deeper Magnus fell in love with Eno, the more he started noticing strange inconsistencies in her behavior. Initially, they seemed small, nothing too alarming. Sometimes she would cancel plans at the last minute with little explanation, or she'd avoid talking about her family. When Magnus pressed her about her past, she deflected, changing the subject with an easy smile or a vague answer. Still, he brushed these off as harmless quirks. After all, their connection was undeniable. Yet the more time they spent together, the more these small red flags began to accumulate. Eno had a habit of disappearing for hours without warning, and when Magnus asked where she had been, she would offer vague responses like, "Just needed some alone time," or "I went out for a walk." Eno was an artist, and she had a certain mystique about her that only seemed to grow the more he tried to understand. But as their relationship progressed, Magnus began to feel a sense of unease, a nagging feeling that there was something hidden beneath the surface, something she wasn't ready to share. Still, his love for her kept him from confronting her directly. He didn't want to question the woman he was beginning to envision his future with. Magnus's parents were traditional, grounded in old values. They had raised him to be responsible, disciplined, and practical, and they expected the same from the people he surrounded himself with. When Magnus introduced Eno to them, they were polite, but it was clear that they weren't convinced. His mother in particular was vocal about her concerns. "She's so unpredictable," she would say, shaking her head. "What does she want out of life? She's an artist, Magnus. She's not going to be able to support you, to build something real." His father, more reserved, would only occasionally offer his thoughts, but his concern was no less evident. "You need someone who can stick by you when things get tough, someone practical, someone who knows what it means to build a life together." Magnus, deeply in love, defended Eno fiercely. "You don't understand her," he would insist. "She's amazing, Mom. She makes me feel alive." But the more his parents disapproved, the more their doubts planted seeds of insecurity in Magnus's mind. He began to wonder if he was making the right choice, yet his feelings for Eno kept him rooted in the belief that love could overcome any obstacle. Despite the doubts creeping in, Magnus was certain of one thing: Eno was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. Their bond, despite the challenges, felt unbreakable. After 2 years together, he decided it was time to propose. He spent months planning the perfect moment, something that would reflect their shared passion and history. He picked a quiet park with a stunning sunset over the horizon, a place that had meaning to both of them. He arranged for a photographer to capture the moment, and he even chose a ring that he knew would suit her taste, a delicate vintage piece that reflected her personality. The moment arrived. Magnus led Eno to the spot, and when she turned to face him, her eyes full of wonder, he dropped to one knee and asked, "Eno, will you marry me?" Her eyes welled with tears and a smile spread across her face as she whispered, "Yes." In that instant, everything felt perfect. The doubts, the fears, the uncertainties of the past all seemed to vanish. For a fleeting moment, Magnus believed their future was set, and nothing could stand in their way. As the days passed and the wedding date drew near, an unmistakable sense of unease began to settle between Magnus and Eno. What should have been a time of excitement and anticipation was instead marked by a growing tension. Eno, once vibrant and joyful, seemed increasingly distant. She would often retreat into herself, her moods shifting without explanation. Magnus noticed the change. At first he tried to attribute it to the natural stress that came with preparing for a wedding, but the signs became harder to ignore. Eno began avoiding discussions about their future and their wedding plans. She would brush him off with excuses like, "I'm just stressed," or "I need some space," but something felt deeply wrong. During one of their final meetings with the wedding planner, Eno seemed completely disengaged, barely paying attention to the details. She was distracted, her thoughts elsewhere. Magnus tried to talk to her, to connect, but she was elusive, her answers short and distant. He wanted to believe that it was just pre-wedding jitters, but deep inside, a nagging feeling told him there was more to it. There was something she was hiding, and Magnus couldn't shake the growing fear that it was something that would change everything. The night before the wedding, Magnus could not sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to push the unsettling thoughts from his mind. He had tried to talk to Eno, but she had once again withdrawn. She had gone to bed early, claiming she needed rest, but Magnus couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the hours ticked by, he grew more and more restless. Just when he thought he might drift off, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. It simply read, "Magnus, before you make the biggest mistake of your life, there's something you need to see. Check your email." Confused and apprehensive, Magnus hesitated but ultimately clicked open the email. His heart sank when he saw the video link. It was an anonymous source, but there was something in his gut telling him that he had to watch it. His hands trembled as he clicked the link, and what he saw was a gut-wrenching shock. The video showed Eno, his Eno, caught in compromising situations with two different men. The footage was raw, intimate, and undeniable. Magnus's mind raced and his stomach churned. The timestamp on the video revealed that these encounters had occurred throughout their entire relationship. His world shattered in an instant. The woman he had trusted with his heart, his future, had been deceiving him all along. He watched in a daze, unable to fully comprehend the enormity of what he was seeing. His emotions ranged from disbelief to rage, but the most overwhelming feeling was heartbreak. He had been blind to her lies, to the betrayal that had been unfolding right in front of him. The discovery of the video shattered Magnus's world. The flood of emotions he felt was overwhelming. Anger, disbelief, confusion, and pain all surged through him. His hands shook as he continued to watch the video. There, in full view, was Eno, the woman he had been planning to marry, engaging in intimate encounters with other men. The images on the screen were clear and unmistakable, confirming the worst of his fears. What hurt the most was not just the betrayal, but the realization that Eno had been hiding this double life for so long. She had been lying to him, deceiving him with every smile, every sweet word she had ever said. The timing of the video was particularly cruel. It wasn't just a random affair or a past mistake. These encounters were recent. It was as if Eno had been cheating on him the entire time they had been together, even as they were planning their wedding. It was the ultimate betrayal, not just of love but of trust. Magnus had thought they were building a future together. Every moment he had cherished now seemed like a cruel joke. How long had she been lying to him? How many times had he been blind to the signs? The hurt was suffocating, and he felt betrayed by every moment he had ever spent with her. Eno's behavior over the past few weeks suddenly made sense. Her distance, her mood swings, her avoidance of serious conversations, it was all part of her deceit. She had been hiding the truth from him, keeping secrets he had never suspected. Magnus's heart shattered as he realized that the woman he had loved and wanted to build a life with had never been honest with him. He spent hours replaying the video, each time feeling more lost. He wanted answers, but at the same time he was afraid of the truth. What else had she done behind his back? What had become of their relationship? Every thought only led to more questions, none of which could be answered. The emotional storm inside Magnus was unbearable. The betrayal felt like an open wound that would never heal. He couldn't focus on anything else. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the video, and it replayed in his mind in vivid detail. Magnus tried to call Ino, but she didn't answer. The silence from her side only added to his anguish. He began to drink, trying to drown the pain in alcohol, but it didn't help. It made everything worse. His anger swirled, mixing with the hurt and confusion, until it became an uncontrollable rage. He began to blame himself. Was there something he had missed? Was he too trusting, too blind to see the truth? He felt like a fool, like he had been played for the entire duration of their relationship. As the night wore on, the storm inside him raged harder. He kept imagining confrontations, scenes where he would confront Ino, demanding answers. His mind spun with questions that he knew couldn't be answered in the way he wanted. In an attempt to numb the pain, he made an impulsive decision. He bought a gun online, convinced that it might bring some control to the chaos, but in reality, the gun only symbolized his spiraling sense of powerlessness. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was consumed by hurt, by betrayal, and by a thirst for revenge. He held the gun in his hand, staring at it, wondering if he could truly go through with it. Would it make him feel better? Would it give him closure? But deep down, Magnus knew this wasn't the answer. He knew the gun wasn't going to fix anything. Still, in the haze of his torment, he couldn't help but feel like it might give him some form of release from the pain. The morning of the wedding had an eerie stillness to it. The sun peeked through the windows, casting a soft golden light on the surroundings, but for Magnus, the world outside seemed to blur and fade. He stood in front of the mirror, the tuxedo tailored to perfection, his hair combed just so, but all he could feel was an immense emptiness. The day that was supposed to mark the beginning of his lifetime with Ino, the woman he had once loved and trusted, felt like a hollow mockery. As he stood there, staring at his reflection, Magnus's mind raced. His thoughts kept circling back to the betrayal, the video, the lies, the realization that his entire relationship had been based on deception. The woman he was about to marry had been unfaithful to him, and worse, she had hidden it so well, playing the role of the perfect bride, pretending like nothing was wrong. His anger simmered beneath the surface, and with each passing minute, it became harder to suppress. Despite his inner turmoil, the wedding continued. Family members gathered, excited for the grand event. Friends talked, laughing and reminiscing about the couple's early days, but for Magnus, all he could feel was an aching sense of disconnection. The words that Ino had whispered to him earlier, promising love and devotion, now seemed like empty lies. How could he marry someone who had lied to him for so long? Ino, on the other hand, seemed radiant as she prepared for the ceremony. She walked around the bridal suite, her eyes glowing with excitement as though everything was perfect. She never once gave any indication that anything was wrong. To the outside world, this was a fairy tale wedding, the culmination of their love story, but to Magnus it felt like the beginning of his personal tragedy. His eyes kept darting to the clock, hoping for the ceremony to end, but knowing deep down that it was only just beginning. As Ino approached him, walking down the aisle in her beautiful white gown, Magnus's heart ached. The woman he had once trusted and loved stood before him, beaming with what seemed like genuine joy. But everything had changed now. Magnus could no longer pretend. The facade was gone. When Ino reached him, she smiled at him, her eyes filled with warmth and love. But Magnus felt nothing but disgust. He could barely look at her without remembering the video, the betrayals, and the lies that had led them here. His heart beat erratically, and a voice in his head screamed for him to speak the truth. The moment the officiant asked, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Magnus hesitated. His mind raced. He thought of the consequences of his next words. He thought of the truth, of the betrayal, of everything they had been through together. His mouth felt dry, and his throat tightened as the words finally broke free. "I know everything," he said, his voice low but clear enough for Ino to hear. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. "I saw the videos. I know about the other men. I know you've been lying to me all this time." Ino's face drained of color, her smile faltering as she realized what had just been said. She reached for him, her hands trembling, but Magnus took a step back. The love they had once shared seemed like a distant memory now, replaced with a wave of betrayal. "Magnus, please, it wasn't what you think. I never meant to hurt you," Ino pleaded, her voice trembling with guilt and desperation. Her eyes filled with tears as she reached out to him, but he recoiled. "You never meant to hurt me?" he asked bitterly. "You lied to me every single day, Ino, and now you're standing here pretending like none of it happened. How can I marry you after all of this?" The guest looked on, unsure of what was happening, whispers filling the air. Eno's face crumbled with guilt as she tried to explain, but Magnus could hear none of it. The damage was done. There was no going back from this moment. The officiant, unsure of how to proceed, stood frozen, but Magnus had already made up his mind. His heart was broken beyond repair, and there was no way he could continue with the wedding. He turned to leave, his body shaking with a mix of grief, anger, and disbelief. Eno's cries followed him, but he was too consumed by the storm inside to care. The confrontation had shattered everything. Magnus's mind raced as he left the church, his steps quick and erratic, his heart pounding. His world had unraveled in that single moment. Everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and his future had crumbled to dust. The woman he had intended to marry had destroyed him, and he couldn't cope with it. Alone in the darkness of his thoughts, Magnus was filled with a sense of helplessness and rage. He could not stop thinking about the betrayal, the lies, the cheating, the videos that had exposed everything. His vision blurred with anger as he stumbled into the back of his car, the weight of his emotions pulling him down. He grabbed the gun, which he had kept hidden in the glove compartment, a symbol of the power he thought he could control. In the haze of pain and fury, the impulse to hurt her, to make her feel the weight of his suffering, overtook his sense of reason. The gun felt cold in his hands, but it was almost a relief. It represented control in a world where everything had been taken from him. He had tried to reason with Eno, tried to get answers, but it was all in vain. The anger, the humiliation, and the sense of betrayal bubbled over, and in one moment of madness he pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the church, and Eno's body collapsed to the ground. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Magnus looked down at her, his heart racing, a mix of disbelief and sorrow flooding through him. He had just killed the woman he had once loved. His hands trembled as he looked at the weapon in his hands, and the reality of what he had done began to set in. Everything became silent. The guests who had once been celebrating now screamed in horror, running for the exits. Magnus stood frozen, unable to process the magnitude of his actions. His mind couldn't reconcile the reality of the situation with the man he had once been. He had loved her, and now he had destroyed her. The arrest came quickly. The police arrived at the scene and took Magnus into custody. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as he was escorted out of the church in handcuffs. The media frenzy was immediate, as the story of the groom who shot his bride on their wedding day became front-page news across the country. The trial was long and drawn out, filled with media attention and courtroom drama. The prosecution painted Magnus as a man who had acted out of cold-blooded revenge, pointing to the premeditation of his actions, the gun, the tension of the previous days, and the clear evidence that he had planned the murder after discovering Eno's betrayal. The prosecution argued that Magnus's emotions were a mere excuse for his actions and that he had intended to kill her all along. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Magnus had been overwhelmed by emotional turmoil and grief. They claimed that he had acted impulsively, out of sheer devastation, unable to process the betrayal he had experienced. The defense suggested that the combination of Eno's lies, his love for her, and the sudden discovery of her infidelities had pushed him into a state of emotional collapse. Throughout the trial, Magnus sat in a daze. The gravity of his actions began to settle on him, but the horror of what had happened, the murder of the woman he had once adored, was too much for him to bear. He couldn't remember a time when he had been more lost. Every day felt like a dream from which he could not wake up. Witnesses, including family members and friends, gave their testimony. They described the shock they felt when they learned of the crime, many expressing their disbelief at the kind of person Magnus had become. People spoke of how kind and loving he had once been, only to fall victim to his rage. Some testified about how Eno had been distant in the days leading up to the wedding, hinting at the infidelities, but no one had guessed the depth of the betrayal. The courtroom grew tense with every new piece of evidence. Magnus's fate seemed to hang in the balance, and the nation watched as the trial drew to a close. After weeks of deliberation, the jury finally reached its verdict. The courtroom was packed, with family and reporters filling every available seat. Magnus sat at the defense table, his hands folded before him, his face expressionless, though his eyes showed the torment of his soul. "Guilty of first-degree murder," the judge announced, his voice grave. The words hit Magnus like a physical blow. The world around him spun as the reality of his fate settled in. He had taken a life, and now he would pay the price. The judge continued, explaining the severity of the crime and the fact that Magnus would serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The prosecutor's words rang in his ears. This was not a crime of passion, this was a deliberate act of vengeance. The jury had found him responsible for his actions, and there was no escaping the consequences. Magnus's eyes blurred with tears as he was led away in handcuffs. His entire life was now a prison of guilt and loss. There was no coming back from what he had done. He had taken Eno's life, and in doing so, he had destroyed his own. As he was taken to his prison cell, all he could think about was the woman he had once loved, now gone. The memories of their time together, the joy, the laughter, the love, were now tainted with the blood of his rage. He had lost everything, and in the quiet of his cell, Magnus realized that nothing could ever fill the emptiness he now felt inside.